our third panel of the day. So welcome to everybody. I will remind you again at the outset that we're going to be recording this discussion for posting to our YouTube page later on. We have once again another incredible panel on civil society-led accountability mechanisms. This is going to be moderated by Pierre François Docquir, who's head of media freedom at Article 19. And our illustrious panel is Jessica Dheere, who's the director of ranking digital rights, Spandana Singh, who's policy analyst with Open Technology Institute. And we also should have Jillian C. York, Director for International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but I think she's just running a little bit late. Pierre, can I hand it over to you? Do you want to take it away?
Thank you, Michael, and thanks for the invitation. Very happy to be here with you all and with the panelists, and hopefully Jillian will join us very soon. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you all are. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the conversation. And we'll make sure to make it a conversation, not only between the panelists, but we will also a bit later on open the floor to questions and comments from our audience. The topic for this session is to look at initiatives led by civil society in relation to accountability of platforms and the challenges that such initiatives have to face. And it so happens that just yesterday, I was on another panel with a very similar topic, on a similar topic. It was a discussion that was convened by a member of the European Parliament, Alexandra Geese, about the role of citizens, the roles that citizens can play in the future of regulation of platforms. That was a debate that was convened at the moment where the Commission, the EU Commission, is preparing to unveil the draft of the Digital Services Act, which in the EU will become a key part of the legal framework for the circulation of online content. And I was on this panel because I had been invited to present a project of Article 19, the thing that we've called the Social Media Council, which we have first developed as a model for the oversight of content moderation on social media, and are now trying to turn it into something real and not only theoretical. This is actually an attempt at building an accountability mechanism, and it's something done by a civil society organization. So I thought it would be, in the topic of this conversation, to say very briefly a few words about this, the Social Media Council. It is a model, as I was saying, for a mechanism of voluntary compliance that we consider would be created by a participation from all stakeholders. That would include social media companies, small and large, academics, journalists, media regulators, and civil society organizations that represent broadly the diversity of society. We think that this mechanism would have two missions, two roles. The first would be to provide an opportunity for individuals to appeal decisions on content moderation that have been made by participating platforms. The second thing would be for the SMC to be a forum to elaborate general guidelines for platforms in relation to content moderation issues. And in the development of this idea, we've suggested that it would do those two things. It would implement those two missions on the basis of international human rights standards, which in itself is a big and interesting topic. I think this SMC will be an independent organization. It will work transparently. It's something that will work in the service of the public. And we've considered that it could be created as a global institution, but also on the national level, except in countries where that would obviously raise safety concerns. But generally, we do think the local level here as very important in terms of giving a voice to actors, local actors who sometimes are not at all in a situation where they can be heard by platforms. And also, if people are to make decisions on content moderation cases, it's all the better if they actually speak the language, if they know the culture, the politics, the history. Broadly, if they have a robust understanding of the context where this content moderation dispute is taking place. So that's the Social Media Council. It's an idea that was endorsed by the former UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay. And it's an idea that we've been discussing with academics, with platforms, and with civil society organizations for a bit of a time now. And we're now trying to launch a pilot experiment of it in a EU country, in Ireland, to be more precise. This is an ongoing piece of work, nothing final yet, but I would say that from the conversations that we have at the moment with a broad range of stakeholders in Ireland, I think I can say that we can be moderately optimistic that we can take this somewhere interesting. One of the things with the project in Ireland is that we're trying to make the Social Media Council fit within a framework of co-regulation, sort of finding ways to ensure an effective complementarity between the Social Media Council and the future regulator of platforms and media in Ireland, which is going to be the Media Commission in the future. The bill is just being debated these days. And there are one of the things working on this project that is, I think, challenging, but also very interesting at the same time, is the novelty of the situation. Content moderation, be it the technicality of it or the impact that it has on daily lives or on public spaces, the solutions that we can all imagine and try and implement. This is all new, and there's a need to understand a landscape that is changing quite fast. There's a need to innovate, and there's also a need to explain everything so that we can also contribute to enabling people, enabling individuals to understand what's going on and then to take part in those conversations and those efforts. Another challenge, of course, is the gap between local actors and the size of social media platforms, and maybe also the gap between civil society organizations and the size of social media platforms. But there are other challenges, and I'm now very curious to hear how our panelists have managed to deal with the difficulties that they encountered in their own work on accountability. So I will now invite our speakers to kick off the conversation with maybe a first intervention. And if that's all right, we'll start with you, Jessica. So you have the floor for, say, about 7 to 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Michael and Neil ISP for inviting me to this panel. My name is Jessica Dheere. I am the director of a research program called Ranking Digital Rights. We're based at New America in Washington, DC, but we work globally in the public interest, specifically around platform accountability. And by platforms, we talk about both digital platforms, social media platforms, telecom companies, and this year, e-commerce companies. Since this panel is about accountability, I thought I would just sort of frame a little bit what we do to try and hold companies accountable. And sort of the first question that for us is sort of, what should companies be accountable for? What should these tech companies be accountable for? We use the human rights framework, and specifically the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, to evaluate accountability, and I'll tell you a little bit about how in a second. We think that companies should be accountable for any potential harms that might result from the deployment and scaling of their platforms, and specifically for the results of their business models, including how their automated and algorithmic systems can distort the information ecosystem, which is what we've been seeing very much recently, but also over the last decades. So ranking digital rights approaches this challenge, first of all, by sort of facilitating transparency, which we think of as the first step in holding companies accountable. And we do this by setting global standards for how platforms should protect and respect users' rights to free expression and privacy. We've developed a research methodology that we've implemented over the past several years in 4 different, what we call the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index, in 4 different editions of this index. The methodology comprises about 60 indicators now, all of which have sort of sub-questions. So we're asking about more than 300 questions in 3 different categories of governance, free expression, and privacy, to evaluate, to basically come up with a ranking of what we think of as the world's most powerful digital platforms and telecom companies. So we use this research methodology both to do the research and the evaluation, but also as a sort of standard, a set of standards that we think platforms should abide by when developing their policies, and use as a roadmap for how to improve the policies that they operate under. We then use this ranking to highlight sort of a lack of disclosure or conformity to sort of human rights norms as they're stated in the UDHR and the Ruggie principles. And we make improvements for recommendations for improvement, both to companies, as well as we also make recommendations to policymakers. And so the goal here for us is to sort of create a race to the top among companies. So not only are they interested in their own scores, but how do they compare against their peers? And we also track how they do sort of year over year. In February, this coming February, we are publishing our 5th index, and this index will be the first one that includes e-commerce platforms, Amazon and Alibaba. And it will also be the first that includes a set of new indicators that we've developed over the past couple of years that are specifically related to targeted advertising and algorithmic systems. And this is important in sort of the content moderation, or sort of accountability for content moderation, because in developing these indicators, we really wanted to interrogate sort of the underlying business models of the platforms that we evaluate, and think of content moderation as more than simply takedowns of content and accounts, but also as content shaping, which I think Spandy will probably talk a lot about. And sort of thinking about how these companies are processing vast amounts of user data in order to target both user-generated content as well as ads to specific groups of people as they infer, as the platforms infer their interest, and or sort of using other data to sort of target and make sure that, or not make sure, but so that target content to specific audiences. And so we wrote a report also earlier this spring that was called we call it the It's the Business Model series, where we really sort of go into great detail. It's a 2-part series about sort of how these algorithms work, or how we think they work, and then also what our policy recommendations around them are. And I say how they think they work because one of the biggest problems that we've seen so far is that companies are not being very transparent about their policies around these systems or how they actually work. There's still a lot of opacity and in the processes. And this is actually, I think, one of the biggest challenges for civil society in sort of evaluating companies and what their effects are sort of at large, that there's a big gap between what they say they do in their disclosures and their policies, which is what we actually use to conduct our ranking, and what the actual practice is. Yeah, so I was mentioning a little bit earlier that there's sort of content moderation for us includes both the sort of takedown of accounts and content and the sort of more traditional sort of way of thinking about what is removed in terms of user-generated content, but it's also very much about determining what content an individual sees online, and it requires vast amounts of sort of processing of vast amounts of personal data in order to determine what they see. And so one of the other big sort of takeaways that we've had over the last year or two is that the lack of, in the United States, of federal privacy legislation and data protection is actually having a big effect on content, on free expression, and also other rights, including sort of freedom of thought and access to information. Because if you're not being shown a certain piece of content or something else is being amplified at the expense of other content, then you're actually not coexisting in the same information ecosystem as everybody else, and you're not actually sort of having the opportunity to develop ideas based on common sets of facts or common sets of even common opinions. So which impedes sort of freedom of thought as well as access to information. So I think what I'll do is sort of leave it there and let Pierre sort of, or you can moderate, or let whoever goes next, and then I'll sort of save some of my other thoughts and insights for later in the conversation.
Thank you very much, Jessica. I think it's interesting that the idea of the complexity of the technology sort of echoes what I was first mentioning, as the novelty and the need for continuous research and innovation there. And then we all want to start with transparency, but how much transparency is enough, and how can we organize that in a way that actually is effective? I think maybe we can come back to that later on in the conversation. For now, I will pass over to Spandana, if that's all right.
Thank you, and thanks again for having us today. So I wanted to talk about a couple of work streams and projects that OTI has put out over the last few years, and then talk a little bit about what some of those challenges we faced in holding platforms accountable through this work is. So similar to RDR, transparency is a key way that we seek to hold platforms accountable, and this has been true in the content moderation space. And then more recently, we've also built out a significant amount of work in the content shaping space, or how platforms are using algorithmic decision-making to shape the content that users are seeing online. So the first sort of area of work I wanted to talk about is transparency reporting. So over the past several years, OTI has been heavily involved in pushing companies to adopt and expand their transparency reporting practices. In 2016, we published our first transparency reporting toolkit, which surveyed how domestic internet and telecommunications companies were reporting on government requests for user data that they were receiving. And the toolkit, similar to the RDR index, sort of outlined what platforms were doing, who was doing it the best, and then made recommendations on how other platforms who were not issuing these transparency reports could start issuing these reports, and then also made recommendations on how those companies that were already issuing these reports could improve their transparency reports to be more meaningful. Today, transparency reporting on government requests for user data has become somewhat of like a widely accepted industry best practice in the United States. And in another report we put out called Getting Internet Companies to Do the Right Thing, we outlined a number of pressure points from civil society and from, taking advantage of current events, which contributed to this outcome. And so some of them include the establishment of the Global Network Initiative, there were the Snowden revelations, and then also, sustained civil society pressure through things like EFF's Who Has Your Back report. So since then, OTI has been really focused on pushing companies to expand their transparency reporting practices to include qualitative and quantitative information about their content moderation efforts. So in 2018, we published our second transparency reporting toolkit, which looked at how 35 domestic and international internet and telecommunications companies were reporting on content takedowns. And it surveyed a pretty broad range of content takedowns. So it looked at government requests for content takedowns, IP takedowns, network shutdowns, and in terms of service enforcement, as well as other categories. And similarly to the first toolkit, it outlined best practices for what meaningful reporting looked like. And then more recently, the sort of transparency lens that these two toolkits has established has informed a lot of the work we've done around how companies, researching how companies use AI for content ranking, recommendation systems, and targeted advertising systems. And then more recently, we have sort of honed those recommendations and that analysis in to look at how they're using these tools to tackle the spread of disinformation on their services. So the second bucket of work I wanted to talk about before I talk through some of the high level challenges and takeaways is the Santa Clara Principles. So also in 2018, OTI, as part of a coalition of organizations and experts, including EFF, launched the Santa Clara Principles. And the principles really outline minimum standards that we believed tech platforms must meet in order to provide adequate transparency and accountability around their content moderation efforts. And the principles have three key elements. The first is numbers. So we wanted platforms to publish comprehensive numbers which outline their content moderation activities. The second is providing clear notice to impacted users. And the third is offering a robust appeals process to users who have been impacted by the content moderation process. And since the principles were launched, a number of companies and actually a number of pieces of proposed legislation have adopted components of the principles. So I definitely think, that has been a helpful way to start to push forward the conversation around accountability. In terms of challenges, though, I mean, none of these efforts, go without challenge. Like Jessica talked, one of the really big problems that we face is the lack of transparency that platforms offer around their operations. And I think, when we talk about this, we often talk about it in the user context and like the users don't know what's happening to them. But I don't think we focus enough on how this actually influences our ability to make relevant and feasible recommendations. Without this kind of qualitative and quantitative transparency, we as researchers, we as civil society, we're unable to properly understand how company processes such as content moderation work, which components work well, which fall short, and which need to change. Of course, we want to hold platforms accountable and where appropriate, encourage responsible and meaningful legislation that holds platforms accountable. But we also want to ensure that our recommendations are relevant, they're feasible. If you think back to 2018, when we were working on the Santa Clara Principles and on our second transparency reporting toolkit, we were really working in a really vague information environment. At that point, companies hadn't even released their community standards publicly. And so to put out, recommendations in that kind of space is incredibly challenging. And over the years, communication and transparency has definitely increased to an extent. But like Jessica mentioned, especially around the algorithmic decision-making space, that really hasn't seen that much progress. And that makes it difficult for us to put out meaningful and feasible and applicable recommendations. The second challenge I wanted to talk about is the lack of input from diverse stakeholders. And I think Pierre talked about this a little bit. Like the title of this event series suggests, content moderation policies are often enforced globally, but they have a range of different local impacts. And platforms continuously face pressure to bring in and account for input from diverse stakeholders, because if they don't, this has disastrous consequences. But I also think this is an area where civil society needs to improve upon as well. So for example, when the Santa Clara Principles were first being drafted, they were put together by a group of primarily Western organizations and individuals. And once the principles were released and we began sharing it with civil society organizations across the globe, many of them noted that these recommendations didn't always resonate with the content moderation realities that they were facing, or that the principles didn't go far enough to address the issues that they were seeing. And so over the past year, we have been hosting a global consultation process in which we are soliciting feedback from different stakeholders around the world with the intention of redrafting the principles to include a more holistic set of ideas. I think, again, this as civil society, we need to do better in this space. And I think that compared to platforms, we are uniquely situated to do so because the way our networks are structured and the way that we already engage with one another is sort of enables this to happen in an easier way. And then the last challenge I'll talk about, and then I'll punt it back to you, Pierre, is identifying enforcement mechanisms when platforms do not act in good faith. So in the US, Congress has a limited role in passing legislation to ensure that platforms uphold their promises when it comes to protecting users. But it can be challenging for stakeholders who, such as us, who receive promises but no follow through. And so it's important that we figure out the appropriate ways to create guardrails beyond company promises. And so, Jessica mentioned data privacy legislation. We can also think through algorithmic accountability mechanisms, which could be established by law. So I think that is also a really important piece of the accountability puzzle.
Thank you very much, Spandana. That's quite interesting. First of all, to sense the idea of progress in the work, and then also that it actually works, it produces results, and it leads somewhere, even if somewhere is basically new challenges and further needs identified and actions needed. Thank you very much. Jillian, welcome, and it's great that you've managed to join us. Sorry that you were held in the limbo of the internet for a little while.
No worries.
And great to have you with us. Can I hand it over to you now for a first intervention?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for having me. And honestly, it wouldn't be a conference if there weren't some small tech problems. So it's lovely to be here. So unfortunately, I came in only near the end of Jessica's talk, and I hope that I'm not repeating anything here. I think the interventions so far have been excellent, and these are all organizations that I and EFF, where I work, have worked with for years. And so I think I'll start on the starting point that we've reached a point as civil society where there's actually really broad agreement on the baselines for transparency, and also a lot of organizations, including the two here, and hopefully mine as well, pushing things forward in specific areas. And I think that that's really an excellent place to be starting in for 2021, particularly as we might be, fingers crossed, moving back into our normal work lives. So first off, I agree with both organizations in terms of this being a time for expansion of transparency practices. I'm personally going to focus on content moderation for the most part, because that's my area, but I agree that there's a lot of room for expansion when it comes to privacy as well. So EFF has been participating in this conversation since longer than I was there. I actually started getting involved in these dialogues back before I was there when I was at the Berkman Klein Center. And EFF, I think, has done one thing really, really well in this regard, and that's been our Who Has Your Back report. Believe it launched in 2012. Please don't quote me on that. But the idea behind our Who Has Your Back report, which up until this year was annual, we actually took a break, as is reasonable for the time. Up until this year, we'd been kind of shifting around in different areas. So we started with a transparency report that looked at the privacy practices of various platforms and other tech companies. And these ranked companies on a number of different categories and areas, and really kind of pit them against each other to get them to advance their own practices. 2 years ago, we switched, or I guess 3 now, we switched to content moderation as a topic. And I think that this was a really successful project. We were able to push some companies, one company in particular, into completely adopting the Santa Clara principles, which Spandy has already talked about, and that was Reddit. But we also managed to get several other companies to take a step forward in their transparency reporting around different areas of content moderation. I don't have slides, so I'm not going to get into the details of that because I think they're hard to retain, but the Who Has Your Back 2019 report is our most recent one. And it looks at areas just like what's in the Santa Clara principles, reporting around numbers, providing appropriate notice to users about how they've violated a rule and what rule they've violated, and of course, remedy, appeal. And then right now, I think Spandy talked about this a little bit, but the process that we're in now to look at the Santa Clara principles again, we've gotten feedback. I can't talk about all of it yet because we do have to get consent from the various stakeholders who submitted that. But I can say that just having looked at some of that feedback, we're seeing a lot more users and civil society organizations want to see more transparency around things like languages, how content is moderated across cultures and in different languages. Who's doing that? Is it automation? Is it Google Translate? We don't know. And that's, I think, another area for us to be looking toward in the coming years. And of course, this has been flagged to us, from a long time back from various civil society organizations, but it's good to see it in aggregate and in data. A couple other things that I just want to comment on. Always going third, you kind of get to just fill in the blanks. I think that there's some other areas where companies really do need to be more transparent. One is I looked at Facebook's new community standards enforcement report, which came out, I believe, yesterday or today. What day is it? I don't know. We're all virtual now. But this term, the Community Standards Enforcement Report, one of the things that concerned me about it is the way that they're viewing hate speech globally. So we know that this is, of course, an important topic. Most companies are trying to tackle it in line in some way with cultural standards, but the issue here is that they're not transparent about the ways in which they program whatever tools they're using to do that. And so over the past year, we've actually seen 2 pretty major incidents and a number of smaller incidents where activists, journalists, musicians were removed for either hate speech or accusations of inauthentic behavior or activity. And were done so without any kind of real transparency, and in some cases without appropriate remedy. So that's another thing to just flag and be concerned about. And I'll use that as a bit of a segue to close this out and say, I think the other area here where we need just so much more transparency is around terrorism and extremism. The past couple of years, we've seen a ramp up of a global effort to tackle extremism or really eradicate it from the internet, to use the language of the Christchurch call. And while I think some of the goal behind this is noble, the devil's in the details, and we need a lot more transparency in terms of what platforms are using as their guideline. We kind of know, we know that they're using the US FTO list, which is inherently political, and we're not seeing a lot of information behind that. So we know that they use it, but we see them kind of obfuscating in public. And I think that that's the kind of thing that users deserve to know, because if we have these platforms that are incredibly centralized, and they are monopolized, users from all over the world are stuck in kind of a morass of this handful of platforms. And so in order to create the world that a lot of these companies have long professed that they want to see, they need to provide users with that kind of information. So thank you.
Thank you very much, and great to have added the topic of terrorism, which is an interesting and important one. I would like maybe to start with asking the 3 of you if there's any reaction that you would have to what the other 2 have shared.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in there. I would +1 to what Jillian has said about how over the past few years, we've really been able to reach as a civil society a good amount of consensus around what transparency should look like. And I think a lot of this consensus is increasingly becoming global. And so I think that's also very helpful pushing our work forward and in helping to hold platforms accountable. And I think perhaps there are lessons in the broader content moderation space for this sort of consensus building that we can then apply to the algorithmic content shaping space as we try and expand that forward.
Thank you.
I don't know if this is a direct response to anything Spandy or Jillian said, but just sort of thinking, yes, I think there is a lot more consensus on what the transparency should be. I still think there are perhaps some challenges, and I think this is sort of alluded to in the description of this session. There are challenges in sort of reconciling the content moderation challenges that happen in environments that are considered sort of less democratic, or I think in the wording of the conference, sort of where maybe information ecosystems are, so-called less developed or less independent journalism. And and then looking at, what's been going on in the United States and sort of the North or the West for the last several years. Before I came to RDR, I was founder and executive director of SMEX, which is a leading digital rights organization that works across the Middle East. And it's been very interesting to sort of see what the different conversations are, both internationally and then also in the US, and how the disinformation sort of content moderation debate in the US and internationally have at times seemed very unreconciled. In particular, one of the things that Ranking Digital Rights advocates for is sort of applying a universal human rights framework to platform accountability and what platforms should be doing, because it is law and it has been ratified by so many countries, and yet in the United States, a lot of the content moderation and debate around expression online revolves around the First Amendment and Section 230. So I think in my mind, it would be, I think there's a lot of alignment on questions of needing more transparency, but I would like to see more, if not alignment, at least interaction and exchange between the sort of groups that are thinking about human rights as a framework and sort of more maybe US or domestic groups that think about civil rights, and sort of more discussion and more sharing and sort of coordination globally on content moderation, and also just sort of broader content shaping issues as well.
Jillian, I see you nodding. Would you like to comment on this?
No, I just absolutely agree. I was nodding, especially with the last point that Jessica said, which is that I think, the processes that we've seen in the past 2-3 years, I think have come from that really genuine feedback from a lot of people within global civil society that groups, especially groups that are based in the US, need to be more inclusive. And so all I can hope is that the processes that many people, or I say we as a very collective we, are trying to build right now will enable that going forward. Because I think really the companies are only going to listen when we have a super broad coalition talking to them.
Yeah, I think that the question here is really the managing to create a critical mass so that we can be heard by companies. And that is a little bit what we're trying to do with the Social Media Council in Ireland, trying to make sure that we've got enough people on board to make sure that the globe together, they need to be heard. And it really makes sense for companies to join the mechanism where all the society is there. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could just add one point. I mean, I think, a lot of, I'm vaguely mentioning this, but I'm realizing that there's audience members who might not know the references that we're saying here. I'll just throw the link into the chat, but one of the efforts in the past few years that brought together a lot of people who are, some of whom are talking now, was an open letter that we did to Facebook around appeals specifically. And, sometimes I think it's really important to remember that as civil society, the exercise is often more important than the outcome. And in this particular case, I think it brought together a lot of organizations that vaguely knew of each other, but just hadn't really talked along those lines. And we're seeing the fruit of that now. So, yeah.
That's very good to hear. Processes being very important in what they bring in terms of alliances and coalitions, in addition to the actual work or deliverables.
Can I add?
So there is a consultation.
Oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to
Jessica.
Please go ahead. Which is that there's sort of an additional step there too, which is that I think one of the other challenges for civil society is just this vast asymmetry between civil society and on the one hand, and governments on the other hand, and companies on the other hand, both of which are, so much more resourced in many ways, particularly the companies. And I think one of the other things that I see happening is that while we have gained consensus on a lot of things, the space is maturing to a point where it's become really difficult or challenging, at least for civil society organizations to be able to keep up with sort of all of the developments that are happening in the digital rights space, which has now sort of expanded to include, it used to be something that was sort of much more small and contained, and now it just kind of, because our whole world is digital and virtual, it's just everywhere now. And so I think it's worthwhile to sort of name that while we have reached consensus, that there is still a really, there's an asymmetry that is persistent, and that the issues continue to get more and more complex. So anyway, so just the idea that, we've achieved a milestone, and yet the problem still continues to expand, and civil society continues to be sort of under-resourced. And I just thought that it might be useful to make that point as well.
That absolutely needed to be said. I think we can all agree on that. I'm curious, maybe we could dwell on this a little bit more. So there is a consultation process around the upgrading or revision of the Santa Clara principles, as you have mentioned. What can we learn from that, do you think, in terms of making sure that we can, as a civil society movement, make sure to be more inclusive? And that would mean, I suppose, listen to more voices on the one hand, but it might also mean enabling certain other voices to take part in the conversation. So there might be some training, there might be some support needed as well in different countries or different organizations that locally we can talk to. Is there any views or comments on how can we continue that process of being a more inclusive civil society and being able to do this I think, two-way communication of global and local?
Do you want me to take that, or Spandana, do you want to take that one?
Go ahead, Jillian.
Go ahead, I'll go after you.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. This is a hard time to answer it, of course, because I think we're in a really weird spot when it comes to funding, just to be perfectly frank. And a lot of the ideas that we had planned for this year were ideas that are easier in person. So for example, thinking through the Santa Clara principles process, I'll just be totally honest. Our plan was to, talk to people in person at events like RightsCon. And while that's possible over Zoom, it's certainly possible. And we did, in the end, go for a very open process, extended the deadline, accepted submissions from all over the globe, and received them. I think, it's important the in-person stuff is really important, and I think we all miss it, right? So what do we do going forward? I think while we're in this state, I think we do have to make sure that we're reaching out beyond our usual circles. And, sometimes open calls are great for that. Other times people find them challenging, right? And so thinking forward beyond the pandemic, again, fingers crossed, I hope that over the next few years, we're able to convince funders to bring a diverse group of people, some of whom may have been able before, but are not now financially able to get to these events, to them, so that we can continue these dialogues in person.
Yeah, and I would just jump in there. One thing that really struck me during the Santa Clara Principles process was how much feedback we got from orgs that, are just not even in like our close digital rights circles, but also just on like the kinds of circles that we would expect. There were a number of orgs that, for example, worked on issues like disability rights and the intersection of that with technology. And I don't think these are organizations that we necessarily talk to every day when we have these content moderation conversations. And so I think that was a really interesting experience, and sort of encouraging that when we do these kinds of consultation processes, we should go one step further and not only just be connecting with digital rights organizations outside of our geographic boundaries, but other kinds of organizations as well.
That's a great point. And I think also that sometimes we can really be amazed at the quality and the level of local expertise in groups that we get to meet. Any other thoughts on this expansion of civil society and the question of being inclusive? Jessica?
Well, I would just say that because there were so many challenges with, the term fake news sort of arose in 2016, but for many years before that, false news had been sort of circulating as sort of an undesirable aspect of law in many sort of post-colonial states. And so in sort of on the same tangent as saying that there's so much expertise internationally, I think if people had if the digital rights and sort of digital media and technology communities had been more tuned in to how things were developing on platforms in the Middle East, in Asia, in places that are non-Western, non-Northern, that a lot of lessons might have been learned, and I think we've missed a lot of opportunities by sort of perpetuating the idea that that because these companies are based in the U.S. and because this technology innovation came here, that this is the fore of the field. And I think very having spent more than a decade in the Middle East working on these issues and being very connected to global civil society in the digital rights space, we foresaw so much of this and had been talking about it ad nauseum on panels for many years. And then, it kind of pops up in the United States environment, and it feels very new. And so I hope that we won't repeat that mistake again for whatever the next sort of crisis is. And I think I would say to that, with my emphasis on sort of looking at data as a way of also influencing content moderation and content shaping, that the whole movement around data colonialism is something that we should all be taking very seriously, and that there are a lot of experiments and sort of things that are being tested around data globally that could end up again, especially without strong federal privacy legislation and data protection, migrating back to the United States if it's not already here. So I just would say we should keep tuned in and not think that that's kind of a one-time deal.
I think we're all nodding in agreement with this point. Maybe there are questions, I think, from the audience, and there's one already. But before that, I was thinking maybe we could come back very briefly to the question of transparency. Because as you have mentioned, and I agree, I think there's a consensus that has been built on the level of transparency, the sort of transparency that we would like to see. But the question remains is, how can I phrase that? How could we help companies to join the consensus? Is there something that you would like to comment, or Jessica?
Well, I mean, I guess I see this as a long, slow game, or a long, slow sort of enterprise, and that one of the ways to do it is through competition. I don't know if anyone has seen, RDR led an EFF, was a co-signatory, and other Human Rights Watch and other organizations, a letter to Apple a couple of months ago, or maybe last month, time is meaningless, basically sort of demanding or calling on Apple to go ahead and implement its anti-tracking updates that it had planned and then postponed at the sort of to give developers more time to conform. This isn't directly related to content moderation, but Apple then, so we sent an open letter, and just yesterday Apple responded with an open response, and they directly called out Facebook and its privacy practices, which was sort of surprising, this sort of very direct kind of bilateral calling out. And so I think the reason I bring that up is because I think some competition between the companies on these issues is really one of the things that we work for at Ranking Digital Rights, by ranking and evaluating and giving companies scores and showing how they're better or worse on governance, free expression, and privacy, and what they in terms of what they disclose and what some of their practices are. And through sort of discussions with them, because we include the companies in all of our research and give them opportunities to comment, as well as sort of, by seeing the results and sort of the comments after the fact. We know that they compete with each other, and we should use that to our advantage to get more disclosure. And we should really be promoting companies when they are doing the right things and showing how their transparency is actually good for the whole ecosystem. That's sort of the key of what we do. And we know transparency alone is not enough. And we hear that criticism a lot, but without it, we have no baseline against which we can evaluate anything else. So, yeah.
I think competition is interesting, because what you're saying is on the one hand, there's the idea of putting the companies in competition against each other to say who's doing better than the others. But also competition law in itself is a field that's a bit new and a bit unusual for human rights organizations. It's also a question of venturing into new areas to continue the work that we are all doing. Spandana or Jillian, any thoughts on
Sure.
transparency?
I would just add that in addition to sort of, trying to create this competition, it's also really important to maintain like a healthy dialogue with companies as we set out these recommendations, because a number of the times that, we've been talking to companies, a lot of them ask like, why, like, what is the point of this transparency mechanism? What is the end goal? And the systems and the processes really vary from company to company. I think it's important that when we think about transparency, we keep the end goals in mind, but we're not being, but we allow some flexibility to account for the services, the size of the platform, so that this competition is healthy, but it's not going to, for example, create a set of standards in legislation that then harm smaller platforms or that are not meaningful. And so I think that kind of ongoing dialogue is also really important.
Yes, very good point. Just maybe to continue on the question of the dialogue, and then we'll open to the audience, because the chat is being drowned in questions that look very interesting. It's a very interesting thing to do, to engage into a dialogue with the different companies, and I think it's very necessary. But when we come to the point where we're telling them that their business model is essentially flawed, what does, doesn't that make the dialogue a bit tense or more complicated than for instance, when we were simply discussing transparency, for instance?
I mean, from my perspective, I think that's where a broad coalition and consensus is really important. I mean, I realize that that's not a perspective that everyone agrees with. It is one that I personally agree with. But again, I think that this, emphasizes the importance of agreeing on baselines, groups, finding common ground around those things. I think there's going to be a lot of disagreement on a number of different issues. There are groups right now that, agree on hate speech, and groups that are on the opposite end of that. But the same goes for things like nudity, and sometimes it's, back and forth crossover, right? And so I think that it's important when it comes to transparency. This is one area that we really can all agree on. And if we as civil society band together on this, companies will have no choice but to listen.
Okay, yeah, good, thanks. Jessica?
Oh, I would just say it's hard for me to think of strong arguments against transparency. And so, I mean, the only argument that I can sort of conjure is, what are they, like proprietary, what do they call that? Like basically intellectual property kinds of, we don't want to show our business hand. I think there are many ways of being transparent that don't necessarily compromise your ability to generate revenue. But I also think that there is a growing consensus with the idea that the targeted advertising business model and the business model of the companies are not necessarily compatible and with human rights and with the things that we generally want. And so, we should work towards consensus on that as well. But it's hard for me to find the argument against transparency in this context. And so, yeah.
Yeah, okay, maybe now is a good time to look at the questions from the audience. I think, Michael, we can invite people to speak but maybe I can read the first questions while the others get ready to share their thoughts with us. There was a question from Adam. He was asking if the panelists could speak about the disparity, the exacerbated disparity in size between the platforms and then CSOs in the global south. Jillian?
Or
I can't. Go ahead.
yeah, I'll just quickly, I mean, I saw the question and I think, I mean, yes, there's obviously a huge asymmetry and disparity in size between platforms and global South CSOs, but I think there are between platforms and all CSOs. But one thing that I would say that is one of the challenges that global South CSOs face is capture in some respects by these platforms. Many of these platforms contribute lots of money to the CSOs. They don't do it with lots. Sometimes they do it with requirements. I've heard stories today, and I think it was today in today's morning session, or it might have been in another session that I attended yesterday elsewhere. But you know, sometimes they come with sort of quick pro quo types of things. We want to be involved in what you do with this money, and sometimes they don't. But I think no matter what, it's a really difficult position for CSOs to be in, because without these funds, or without funds, they can't continue to operate. And so if they do feel a measure of independence, you know, so there's a capture issue, and there's also the issue, for example, and sometimes this is where I get very I'm a little bit sort of blurry on the engagement. It kind of depends on who's engaging whom, because with the Facebook Oversight Board, for example, consultations were done all over the world with, you know, large groups of civil society organizations in every region. Well, that's a good thing if all of that feedback is actually taken to heart and invested, and these organizations continue to feel a sense of ownership in that process. But it also could be interpreted, if it's not managed properly, and if there isn't a persistence there, it could also be interpreted as sort of, you know, just kind of paying lip service to these organizations. Oh yes, we consulted you, and then we went ahead and sort of did our own thing. And there's, you know, I think, you know, I'm not saying that that's what happened in the oversight board process, because many of the people who are serving are also from some of these organizations, but I think there is a challenge there. It's kind of a similar challenge to the fact that Facebook and Google, who have you know, eviscerated sort of the news through their advertising capture, are also, you know, then turning around and giving, you know, money to independent news initiatives, but not nearly enough to sort of make up for the losses. So there's issues there.
Yeah, very, very good point. I think that there's another panel tomorrow, which will focus more on the oversight board. So, you know, as a free speech lawyer, I do not like to discard topics or intervention, but I will just suggest that maybe that will be for others to discuss. Michael, is there somebody who wants to speak, or maybe I should have invited people to use the raise your hand function?
Yeah, so anybody who wants to, please do raise your hand. I see Art has been quick on the draw. Art, do you want to ask a question?
Right, thank you. I heard raise your hand and then clicked on it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the discussion. I have so might be a bit selfish, but are there methodologies you think would be helpful in contributing to other kinds of work which civil society could be engaging, that you don't see so beyond the work the valuable work your organizations have been doing?
For fear of hogging the mic, I'll just quickly say that the methodology that Ranking Digital Rights uses is completely open and has been adapted by several organizations to do more localized sort of looks at ISPs, at mobile telecom operators, and others in other regions of the world. And we're actually going to be doing a lot more of that. We've been wanting to do a lot more of that for a long time, and have finally, you know, found a mechanism through which we can do that in a more dedicated way. So and including helping organizations sort of wade through the complexity of the methodology and edit it for their needs, and also to assess sort of where the value is in doing such a ranking vis-a-vis the kind of markets that you're dealing with, whether you have state-owned or competitive enterprises, et cetera. So
yeah, I suppose that when you're faced with 300 questions or more in lots of different categories, that can be a little bit scary for smaller organizations to try and find out how they can adapt, and there's a challenge there. Any of the Spandana or Jillian, did you want to comment on this question?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I can just add, I put it in the chat, but our Who Has Your Back methodology is also open. It is a much simpler report than what Ranking Digital Rights puts out. But we've also done a handful of kind of, I don't even want to say one-offs because I actually think some of them repeated, but we've done some global versions of the Who Has Your Back report on privacy in a couple of regions of the world. I'm going to get them wrong if I try, but one of them was Latin America and telecoms, and I forget what the other one was, but it's definitely worth checking out.
Spandana, did you have anything to comment on this question?
I mean, I don't know if I have something specific about methodology, but just as we're thinking through the algorithmic transparency space, one area where I definitely see value is having more conversations that are involve more than just policy people. It seems like, even when we talk to companies, these conversations are all with stakeholder engagement and policy folks. And I think that often impedes our ability, again, to make useful recommendations if we can never talk to the technical side of those companies. So, and I think that is necessary beyond just the US. I think that's necessary around the world. So I welcome anyone who wants to try and bridge that gap. It's definitely a difficult one. Yeah,
very good point. Thanks. And I was just thinking that coming back to the question of Art, that sharing methodologies and working to adapt it with a new partner or looking at a new region or country, that may also be a way or an opportunity to build ties with new organizations and new partners and continue to expand this global society movement and make it as inclusive as possible, as we were previously discussing. Thank you, Art. Let's try and say the magic words again and see if somebody else pops up. Anybody wants to raise their hands?
Just while we're I see Andres Calderon. I was going to draw your attention to one of the questions in the chat, because there's a few of them, and then maybe Andres can go right after. There's a question from Adwa Ankoma, and I can only apologize for what I can assume is a horrible mispronunciation. But it talks about the representation of users in the Global South in setting and applying content moderation standards. And I would be very, very interested to hear from any of the panelists about their thoughts on that as an accountability question. So to take an example, I think if you did a poll of Facebook's users, certainly in certain parts of the world, there would probably be a lot of support for a moderation rule that says blasphemy is not allowed. You're not allowed to insult religions on the platform, right? Now, I would not want to see that imposed as a Facebook rule, right? Folks with a human rights background would probably have a problem with that. Where do you see that? Do you have thoughts on that tension? What is the role of user opinions in setting these moderation policies, particularly when user opinions might go against what we'd want to see from a human rights perspective?
Jillian?
Yes, sorry, trouble with the mute button. Sure. I mean, I come from a free expression background, and I do think that content moderation that is centralized and that is not the choice of users should be limited, right? But of course, we're talking about broadening that perspective out to hear from users. Personally, I think that this is where user choice comes in. We've heard kind of rumblings of this recently from Jack Dorsey at Twitter. But when nudity is a great example, right? Because it's easily classifiable. Automation can detect it pretty easily and decide, okay, these are breasts, these are not, etc. Although this is getting more complex for good reason. But this is something where I'd rather have users be able to flip a switch so long as the content is legal. And I think that that's the right move. Companies have the technology now to do this for a large range of content. And so there's really no reason for them not to. except for, I would guess, pressure from governments and other external forces. So yeah, I think I'd much rather see that. I'd much rather see a range of expression permitted regardless of what users say, because you're always going to have marginalized groups and minority groups inside of that broader context. So even if you have a lot of people in one country saying we don't ever want to see nudity, so long as it's legal, I think that that choice needs to be up to the individual.
That's a very good point, but it also means that you then turn to promoting and encouraging companies to use certain technologies and the algorithmic classification of content and the algorithmic distribution of content. And if it works, that's good. But we are also sometimes, as civil society, sometimes very, very cautious towards the same technologies when they're used to take down content or simply to classify it as be terrorism or on another category of content for takedown.
I agree there. And I think that, first of all, we have to recognize that it's already in place in a lot of cases, that there's no rolling back on that. But at the same time, automation should be limited. Humans should always be in the loop in that process, particularly when it comes to appeals. And so there's a lot of ways that we can mitigate around this, but for where technology is good for classifying certain content, we can use this to positively classify content in a way that allows users more choice.
Thank you. Any thought or comment from Jessica or Spandana on this question?
I would add, I also think when we talk about content moderation, we tend to think of it as a one size fits all for all platforms, and that's not true. You have platforms like Reddit where the content moderation structure is much more decentralized, and there are always going to be trade-offs with having a different system. But I think that Reddit has been a really interesting model to look at for enabling niche communities and more localized perspectives to flourish and for those communities to have more agency online.
Thank you. Jessica, did you want to add something?
No, I think Jillian and Spandy did it well.
And I would agree, of course. We've lost our comrade, Andres.
That's not,
you're still with...
No, he's there. Andres, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I was very interested about the idea that transparency might foster competition, and this is the reasoning that it seems to be followed by the European Commission, and the new Digital Service Act might actually put in place some measures regarding algorithmic transparency or some other type of transparency rules for digital platforms. But I wonder if you feel, maybe this is just me, that it's a little bit over optimistic to try to think that transparency will actually achieve a greater competition between platforms. I'm thinking about, and I would love to hear your thoughts of whether there might be something similar to the privacy paradox regarding content moderation, in as much as millions of people or billions of people engage in conversation, and they all want different rules about what should be kept on the platforms or taken out from the platforms. So it would be very difficult to for those companies to settle for new rules that would actually satisfy all of those users, right? So I wonder if making those rules more transparent would actually make a change, and that change being having the best companies, the best platforms with content rules, with content moderation rules thrive in the market, and the other ones would eventually leave the market or will lose the preference of the users.
Who wants to jump in? Yeah, Jessica.
I guess it's somewhat directed to me, since I was talking about transparency earlier. And if I'm understanding, how optimistic, again, I kind of, if I kind of don't know what the other option is, right? Like sort of pushing for transparency to me is sort of the beginning of the conversation, and whether it really engenders sort of, you know, robust competition, perhaps maybe that's being overly, you know, Pollyanna-ish, or overly optimistic. But I kind of don't know what else to ask for in order to be able to assess. And I think, you know, I think in some cases the premise, you know, or at some point in time, maybe the premise was, oh, if we can get companies to be more transparent, then users can do a better job of evaluating which companies are better for them. I'm not there, because I think there's so little choice, and very few people are going to wade through the policies to actually understand and evaluate and compare them, which is why when I'm saying sort of shorthand, you know, ranking digital rights basically reads the policies so nobody else has to. And while I think part of the theory of change used to be that it would enable users to make better choices, I really think it's more about what Spandy said, is that it makes people who are really following the conversation able to make better recommendations, to do better assessments of what policy should look like, and to inform policymakers, to hold companies' feet to the fire when they're not being transparent. And where they're not being transparent, I think Jillian was mentioning, is really around enforcement and how they're and remedy, and what the data that we'd like to see in transparency reports in terms of government requests as well as private requests, third-party requests for data. And so we're not asking, it's not only transparency in their policies, which is the very first indicator, that the very first thing that we look at is the policy publicly available and accessible? Is it in the right language for the market that it's working in, and a couple of other, is it in clear language? But it's really more about, you know, getting to a level of transparency where you can actually assess practice versus their policies, because that's really what's hard, because you can never quite judge. We evaluate disclosures and what's public in terms of what they say they do, but what they do, we cannot see the whole picture. And, you know, even as a society, we can't see the whole picture. And so getting them to provide information that allows us to reconcile what they say they do with what they're actually doing, getting closer to that, to me is where we're trying to push things. I hope that gives some sort of satisfaction to your question.
Thank you. Is there anything to add from Spandana or Jillian?
There's one more question for Abby that we can go to if we've just got about a minute or so left for a quick one more.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty quick. I just wanted to circle back to a point that Jillian had made in responding to Michael's last question. I think that there's still a tension if we were to allow users in, let's say, Saudi Arabia, to choose their content moderation preferences, to exclude nudity, etc., because I think those preferences are still forbidden legally in many of the more repressive regimes around the world. And so how would you, in advocating for more user choice, knowing that users will probably prefer more conservative standards of what like social content they're comfortable with, how would you square that with advocating for more freedom of expression legally from the leaders of those regimes?
Sure. So I mean, I want to clarify, I did say that in contexts where it's not legal, companies often don't have a choice. But moving beyond that particular point, I think there's a couple things here. I mean, one, Saudi Arabia aside, I think often it would surprise you. One of the things that Egyptian users come up against with Twitter, for example, is that Twitter censors more profanity than Egyptians use on a regular basis. And this is a constant conflict that you have an American company deciding what's appropriate for people in the Middle East to say. And this has been going on for years. It's often those users who get the brunt of censorship. When it comes to political speech, profanity, things like that, of course, nudity is a different question. And so you are going to have a lot of cultural contexts where that's not acceptable. But again, so long as it's legal, give users the choice. And if it's not legal, then, you know, I think that that's, again, where we as global coalitions need to come together and talk about what, as a global society, is acceptable in terms of free expression. Of course, you know, from my perspective, we also encourage all countries to follow their own obligations when it comes to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Saudi, I believe, is not a party to that, but the vast majority of conservative and authoritarian countries actually are. So they do have, you know, obligations here, legally speaking.
Thank you, Jillian. I think, Michael, we've got to wrap up. Yeah,
we're just at the end of the session. Thank you so much to Pierre for moderating, and to all three of our panelists. I found this to be a fascinating discussion, a wonderful discussion, as I knew it would be with such a great group. So thanks very much to all of you. This is our final session for today. But tomorrow morning, we're going to be starting back up again at 10 Eastern time with a session on comparative approaches to intermediary liability. And we've got two other sessions throughout the day. So please do join us again tomorrow, and please join us in a virtual hand for our speakers again. Thank you all for joining us. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.